Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Those here in the room, it's lovely to see you again. Those following us online, welcome, and thank you so much for your interest in this important subject. My name is Benjamin Gadan. I'm the acting director of the Latin American program here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The issue of civil society and the broader struggles in Central America is of deep interest to me, to our Latin American program, and to the Wilson Center more broadly. I personally first started focusing on Central America issues just after the coup d'etat in Honduras in 2009, when I was responsible at the State Department for Honduras issues. And I'm deeply saddened to say that the challenges that I worked on in those days are not only present, but have in many ways worsened both in Honduras and many neighboring countries. That includes governance challenges, violent crime, climate change impacts on agriculture, and down the line. In the context of these diverse and worsening in many ways challenges, the role of civil society is more important than ever to serve as a watchdog for good governance, to compensate for imperfect democratic institutions across the board. And so that's why it's so deeply worrying and unfortunate that civil society is under such stress in parts of Central America, where public officials and criminal organizations are increasingly silencing dissent of all kinds, including from non-governmental organizations looking out for the interests of the broader populations. In El Salvador, we've seen many examples of this, including the abuse of government surveillance against media institutions, the criminalization of dissent across the board in ways that silence dissent and make it difficult for journalists to perform their critical democratic function. We've seen in Honduras the increasingly commonplace murder of journalists and environmental defenders and other civil society figures whose voices are absolutely essential in that society. In Guatemala, we've seen journalists and others investigating public corruption being intimidated, threatened, arrested, and in many cases exiled. This is all bad enough. In Nicaragua, however, the situation is far worse. The Ortega regime has silenced critics through arbitrary detentions and by shutting down over 2,000 non-governmental organizations and closing more than 50 media outlets, also using tactics to criminalize dissent and the practice of independent journalism and efforts to deprive non-governmental organizations of critical financing, both local and importantly international, that has been the lifeblood of their ability to operate in these very difficult times. In one response, Central American journalists recently met in Guatemala to organize a network of Central American journalists to address many of these challenges, a promising sign of regional coordination, but a troubling signal that it was necessary in the first place. Today, we're going to discuss the Biden administration response to the growing threats to civil society institutions in Central America. The administration's strategy for addressing the root causes of migration in Central America includes an important emphasis on civil society and has from the very beginning. To strengthen civil society and now address the growing threats that I've just outlined, the USAID Administrator Samantha Power, during the June Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, announced the New Voices Initiative with a focus predominantly on El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. I'm delighted that the Wilson Center and our Latin American program are partners today in supporting the Voices Initiative, in raising its profile, and importantly, in promoting continued conversations with civil society leaders and other experts who also care deeply about this initiative and are eager to contribute. To discuss Voices, we'll hear shortly from an exceptional group of experts, including my friend and former colleague, Emily Mandrella, a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, Luis Villa Herrera, co-founder of Transparency, Social Control, and Open Data in El Salvador, Claudia Escobar Mejia, a distinguished visiting professor at the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at George Mason University, and Pedro Vaca Villarreal, Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression at the Organization of American States, the OAS. I'm now more than thrilled to introduce Undersecretary Ezra Zaya. She is the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights at the State Department. She last joined us for a terrific event in Los Angeles during the Summit of the Americas, where we welcomed Gabriel Boric, the president of Chile, and addressed broad threats to democracy throughout the Western Hemisphere. Undersecretary Zaya was sworn in by Secretary Blinken in July of last year. Previously, she had served as president and CEO of the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and before that spent 27 years in the U.S. Foreign Service. Today, the bureaus and offices she oversees play a leading role in U.S. efforts to strengthen global democracy, advance human rights, promote the rule of law, and support refugees and humanitarian relief. The Undersecretary is deeply committed to these issues globally, as you can tell, but in particular in the Americas and Central America, where she has spent a great deal of her time focusing on this very difficult set of problems and coming up with creative solutions to strengthen and partner with the civil society actors on the front lines of this struggle throughout Central America. So please join me in welcoming the Undersecretary, and thank you again for being here.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be with you all in person and virtually today. And I'm grateful to be joined for this discussion by some of our premier policymakers and practitioners who are working tirelessly on defending civic space in Central America. It's wonderful to see my dear friend and colleague, Deputy Assistant Secretary Emily Mandrela, joining the panel from the State Department, where I know she will represent us impeccably. I also just want to offer a huge thanks to the Wilson Center for hosting us here today. Thank you, Ben, and your team, and also to Eric Olson of the Seattle International Foundation for moderating our conversation. But finally, a profound thank you to the individuals and organizations, including those in our in-person audience and online, who are working daily to defend, protect, and promote civic space in Central America and globally. We look forward to your insights and your questions. Now, as Ben aptly described, around the world, civil society actors and independent journalists are working to protect human rights and fundamental freedoms, advocating for government transparency and accountability, promoting rule of law, and exposing corruption. Civil society representatives are also helping to ensure that all voices are heard, including those of women, girls, indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, LGBTQI+ persons, and many others who otherwise can be marginalized. They often work in the face of threats, harassment, intimidation, and physical attacks. Such actions are all too often carried out with impunity. For our part, the U.S. government views a robust and diverse civil society, including non-governmental and community organizations, independent media, private sector associations, faith-based entities, and academic institutions, all as an essential building block of democracy and development itself. We are deeply concerned by the increasing trends of contracting civil society space throughout the region. These trends are not only problematic for the health of democratic governance in Central America, but they also are a real constraint on our ability to deliver the kinds of results for the people of Central America that we're seeking to achieve through the root causes strategy. In some cases, we've had to pivot away from governmental partners out of necessity, and the actions of these governments and private actors to constrain the freedom of civil society poses a serious obstacle to progress in the region. Some governments also impose foreign funding restrictions or misuse national security and anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing laws to clamp down on civil society and independent media's rights to exercise their essential freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. The unlawful or arbitrary use of surveillance technologies and internet shutdowns can cut off the public's access to information, undermine democratic debate, and hinder the vital work of civil society and journalists. These challenges may also extend to threats and reprisals from governments and their proxies when civil society representatives or journalists participate in international dialogues on human rights or related topics. Reporters Without Borders' most recent World Press Freedom Index cautioned that Latin America was an increasingly toxic environment for the press, especially for investigative reporters focused on holding power to account. The report said, increasingly visible and virulent, these public attacks weaken the profession and encourage abusive legal action, smear and intimidation campaigns, especially against women, and online harassment of critical journalists. As our own State Department's 2021 country reports on human rights clearly outline, the erosion of freedom of expression is especially alarming. In Guatemala, for example, the report documents an increase in intimidation and resulting self-censorship. This includes journalists having to flee the country after publishing articles critical of influential citizens. Pressure, threats, and retribution from public officials and criminal organizations regarding the content of their reporting, and ongoing online attacks that have real-world consequences. Most recently, in the case of Jose Ruben Zamora, who remains jailed and who I was honored to meet during my last visit to Guatemala, the United States has urged the full respect of due process under Guatemalan law. In El Salvador, the passage and implementation of the April 5th Criminal Code Amendment by the Legislative Assembly, criminalizing reporting on certain gang activities, has had a chilling effect on journalism, leading some to self-censor. Though we are unaware of any prosecutions under its stipulations, as written, it could lend itself to attempts to censor the media, prevent reporting on corruption and other matters of public interest, and silence critics of the Salvadoran government. We remain very concerned about threats and intimidation of free press in El Salvador. So rather than simply admiring the problem, what are we doing in response? The State Department works intensively to protect civic space and empower civil society organizations, including and especially in times of crisis. We aim to persuade governments to maintain open civic space and to allow civil society to play its unique and positive role. As a result, we, in partnership with USAID and other departments and agencies, have developed a whole-of-government initiative to protect, defend, and promote civic space in Central America called Voices. As Ben noted, Administrator Samantha Power launched Voices as an interagency initiative at this year's Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles. Since then, we've had regular consultations with stakeholders, launched new programming that directly contributes to the goals of Voices, and hosted a series of panels at the Central America Donors Forum last month in Honduras that gave a platform to experts to discuss current challenges within a regional context. Today marks our first formal Voices event here in Washington, D.C. Now, in developing this initiative, we analyzed the main challenges to civic space in the region and reviewed our diplomacy, advocacy, and assistance through that lens. Based on this exercise, we designed Voices with a focus in 3 areas. First, promoting digital democracy and countering digital authoritarianism. Second, promoting freedom of expression and strengthening independent media. And third, countering the criminalization of civil society actors and providing physical, digital, and legal protection as necessary. We'll hear a lot about each of these lines of effort in today's discussion. U.S. foreign assistance programs, including those under the Voices Initiative, are prioritizing building the capacity of local civil society and independent media to demand transparent, responsive, and accountable government institutions that foster respect for human rights and the rule of law and support democracy. We also want to emphasize the importance of collective efforts to counter democratic backsliding. No one government or institution can do this alone. This requires an understanding of the ecosystem as civic actors and those allies in government and the private sector who need to work and come together when authoritarian tendencies are on the rise. Existing programming also allows the United States to provide assistance directly to embattled civil society organizations and journalists who are under threat or attack. For example, the Department of State's Rapid Response Programs, largely managed through our Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, directly supports civil society actors and journalists who are at risk due to their human rights-related work. We're excited to share how voices can respond to existing threats to civil society during today's panel. Now, finally, in the context of defending civic space, I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to mention the annual international campaign, 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, which runs from November 25th, the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, to December 10th, International Human Rights Day. The 16 Days of Activism campaign, launched in 1991, has been used worldwide to call for the elimination of gender-based violence, or GBV. The statistics here are simply chilling. 1 in 3 women worldwide are victims of gender-based violence. But 14 out of the 25 most dangerous countries for women are in Latin America. The department takes this campaign and the threat of gender-based violence seriously, and we're working diligently to prevent and respond to gender-based violence through policies and programming integrated worldwide. We applaud the Wilson Center's commitment to address gender-based violence. Your ongoing gender-based violence program advances women's economic empowerment as a tool to reduce violence against women, shed light on existing gaps in legislation, advocates for policies to effectively protect women from violence, and aims to reduce and eliminate barriers to implementation. Now, with that, I'd once again like to thank all of the organizations here for your vital work to advance truth, freedom, justice, and accountability under difficult and often dangerous conditions. The United States is committed to partnering with and learning from you. I know this is going to be a really impactful and exciting conversation today, so I'd like to hand over to Eric and our panelists to get this going, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning. It's great to be back at the Wilson Center in person. Thank you to Benjamin Gadan, a colleague and a friend for a number of years, and for all your work with great staff, Anders Beal and Beatrice Nice. We appreciate you giving us the space to discuss what I think are incredibly important issues in Central America and in U.S. policy as well. And thank you, Undersecretary, for your words of commitment to civil society, working with and partnering with civil society. So we are delighted to have this opportunity to deepen the conversation a little bit around these issues. And I think what I'd like to do with the panelists is kind of have 2 rounds of questions. The first one is to hear about some of the specifics around the issues that have been highlighted here: digital democracy, human rights defenders and protections, and independence of the press. And I'd like to hear you go a little bit deeper into those issues, how you experience them, how you see them. And then Deputy Assistant Secretary Mandrela, we'd ask you to also respond a little bit in terms of U.S. policy in that direction. And then I think the second round, I'd like to get into more how we can all work together, what the U.S. government initiatives can mean to civil society in Central America. And then I promise to try to leave at least 20 minutes for people to be able to ask questions as well. So prepare yourself, be ready with your questions, and we'll have some time for that. So if I might start, I'd like to start with Judge Claudia Escobar, good friends, and thank you for what you've done on behalf of Guatemala. Claudia is a former judge, as I say, and a distinguished visiting professor at George Mason University. She's also started her own organization called Be Just, but I'd be kidding you if she didn't, I didn't mention all the other initiatives she's been involved in over the years. But I wanted to start with you because You yourself have experienced some of what we've been talking here. You yourself have been a target of persecution. And at last count, I think there are now 31 judges and prosecutors from Guatemala that have had to flee and leave the country. Can you just talk a little bit about what that is, what's going on, how this kind of criminalization is impacting Guatemala, the rule of law, you, the community? And I would just add here, I'm sorry, I should have said this at the beginning, you're welcome to speak in Spanish if you feel a little more comfortable. We do have simultaneous translation, so feel free. Hablamos cualquiera, solo que no hablo alemán, así que eso no.
Feel free to speak in Spanish. I don't speak.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. Thank you to the Wilson Center for the invitation, and I'd be glad to share, some remarks about my experience, but if I can do it in Spanish, it will be better. I'll feel more comfortable. Bueno, creo que
Well, I think we are facing a very dramatic situation in our judiciary in Guatemala, in which judges, researchers, prosecutors are being persecuted for their fight against corruption.
en la que vemos
Now, we see that the rule of law is collapsing, and there's a lack of credibility in institutions when there is persecution of key actors who fight against corruption. So we are talking about two general prosecutors who have been exiled, Supreme Court justices, judges that have presided over anti-corruption cases against civil servants or powerful people such as people in the armed services who violated human rights during the armed conflict. So this is a situation in which people in Guatemala are losing trust in Guatemalan institutions. Judges are the de facto and par excellence defenders of rights. If the judiciary doesn't do that, well, who's going to defend those who defend the rights of women, of indigenous peoples, of people who are working to protect and enhance the environment? So this is a situation in which we do indeed see that institutions are losing their credibility. People are losing trust in institutions. We need to focus on this because institutions are have been co-opted by organized crime, even in the judiciary. These are criminal groups behind this that seek impunity, and to ensure impunity, they attack judges who have proven to be independent and prosecutors who have carried out objective and independent investigations. We've spoken of 31 people who have been exiled or have gone into exile. There are others who have been incarcerated and who are being tried. Yes, there are some lawyers, prosecutors, former prosecutors who worked with the International Commission Against Corruption, SIG, that haven't left the country, and so criminal cases have been brought against them. The most dramatic case is that of Virginia La Parra, a lawyer who has been incarcerated for 10 months, and she has been accused of carrying out or bringing an administrative report against a judge regarding someone who was under investigation. So her crime was simply to bring an administrative complaint. And for this, she's been jailed. And that's the clearest example of the systematic persecution that we see against operators of justice. And you feel that there are still people within the Guatemalan system who are still fighting the good fight? Well, based on my experience in the judiciary, I would say yes, there are still judges and prosecutors who are willing to work to strengthen the rule of law, but we do have to take into account that there is much fear. These people are they're afraid of reprisals. We're not talking about being a judge in Canada or Spain, where their security is assured. this is the key aspect that we have to focus our attention on. How are we going to protect and empower operators of justice who are willing to fight for their country? Because we're speaking about a context in which there's much violence, much repression, and we need to zero in on that. Now, I would imagine that support has to be given to those who have gone into exile. Yes, I believe the international community has contributed much for decades now to strengthen the rule of law in the region, to shore up institutions, to work to ensure the independence of judges. And all of this work that's been done, we're talking about millions of dollars that have been invested by cooperation agencies of different countries. But if that effort isn't bolstered, and if support isn't given to all these operators of justice who have been highly trained, then all that will have been for naught. It will all be lost, because these are people with much experience, and that experience can be brought to bear from different angles to continue working in the region, to continue strengthening the rule of law. So it's not just a personal loss for them, but for the whole country. Yes.
Briefly, and we'll come back to some of these other points, but speaking with Luis Villatorro Herrera.
Hard name to say.
No, Villatorro Herrera. I can do it. Thank you, Luis. You're welcome to speak in English or Spanish. But you're the co-founder of the Transparency, Social Control, and Open Data organization. I know it is TRACODA. We at the Seattle Foundation have worked closely with TRACODA over the years, so I'm glad that you're here to talk about what you're doing. You're from El Salvador, and I think, there's an issue of disinformation throughout the region. We struggle with it in our country here. But I think if you think, we think about El Salvador, there's just a tremendous amount of disinformation, ways in which the internet has been used against human rights defenders. Talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges TRACODA tries to address with digital democracy and disinformation.
Thank you so much to the Wilson Center to have us here. I just want to highlight that we have a big problem right now. We are living in a pandemic, and I'm not referring to the COVID-19. The citizens are being flooded by fake news, disinformation, and misinformation. The government in El Salvador have almost a blank check to pay troll centers to spread fake news, disinformation, and misinformation. And that's a threat to democracy. As TRACODA, we're trying to work with people because we need to go local in order for them to understand what is happening and why is that so important. Because the hate speech that is coming from these demagogues that are in power right now is hard to fight because we don't have enough resources. Right now, as I said before, we are living in this pandemic where the rise of authoritarian governments is here. And it's dangerous because they manage the narrative and the people believe everything. The people don't understand what democracy do in their lives. And that's a very good point to talk because all of these TikToks, memes, and the Twitter rule of government in El Salvador has a lot of power. The people are in love of that because they say, yeah, my president have things done. Did you see his tweet from yesterday, for example? And a lot of people doesn't know the difference between a fake news and a real one. And the hate speech that is coming from the government attack the free press, attack civil society organizations. As I said before, again, they have like a blank check. They have a spyware, they have AI, they have different tools in order for them to enhance their reach. I was talking with a friend from Panama and also with a friend from Guatemala, and they love my president. Yeah, I saw a TikTok from him, and it was amazing. He's doing, like, great things. okay, yeah, I live in the countries of wonders, but not because it's a wonderful country right now, because I wonder where the democracy is going, where the human rights are right now. So I think it's a lot of discussion, but we have a lot of points to highlight right now. And at the end of the day, we're going to face that, and the United States is also going to face that, because we are seeing Venezuela and the migration from Venezuela and Nicaragua. They are dictatorships there. So we are going to that path, I think, and it's a very dangerous one. And even more with his likeliness in the people, because the people doesn't understand the abstract concept of democracy. Because at the end of the day, democracy doesn't translate into a meal in your house. And all these technologies that they are using are helping for them to say, yeah, it's okay because my president have things done. And no other president has done that.
There was a recent article in Reuters that kind of exposed a lot of this technique around the use of troll farms, the net centers, they call them in Central America. Talk a little bit about how significant that is, and what kind of a challenges that poses to Salvador in general, and how Tracola tries to push back against that.
Yeah, so I think it's very important also to talk about the work that Tracola is trying to do. Yeah. As I said before, we don't have enough resources to go in each community in the country, but we're trying. We are working local. We're implementing this kind of methodologies or horizontal methodologies where we use memes and TikToks and all of the same tools that the government is using, but in a fun way for them to understand what democracy is, what means the access to public information, for example, and how that can affect your daily life. We are trying to strategize right now because it's very hard for us work in this environment because the government is targeting you because the work that you do. They use different technologies. The government uses different technologies that push civil society organizations, journalists to self-censor. And we're trying. But I think Voices needs to be this initiative that needs to be bold. It's the time to be bold. Because if we don't do that, we cannot expect different outcomes doing the same.
I want to come back to the Voices initiatives, but maybe in the second round. And so I want to just ask you one more question about Tracola and its strategy. You're talking about using techniques and messaging that's really appealing to young people. Is this part of your strategy? I mean, is this really about targeting and focusing on young people? I know most of the Tracola staff I know are very young. So talk to us a little bit about your focus on universities, for instance, and your focus is on young people.
Right now, it's not just universities. We are aiming to work with high schools. Because they're the ones that are going to vote in the next elections. Right. So it's important for them to understand what is happening and that we have rules, or at least we think that we had rules. So we are aiming to work with them to understand. In El Salvador, the structural educational system is not the best, and the rural areas are like harder to get into. But we're going to implement the next year this series of formation processes with these kids between the age of 14, 15, and 16. Because if they know what is happening, they can question. And there's nothing wrong with question what is happening. So we have a lot of people that doesn't understand completely what is happening, because they simply doesn't care. And the work that we are going to do is with them, with the youth. But that doesn't mean that we are not working with people with other ages. Because I put this example a lot of times. I was in a place where two private security people, like, I think they were like 60 years old or 55, I don't know. But they were with their phones in TikTok hearing the information about the president. So this needs to be a more integral approach, not just with the youth that we are aiming with them, but to work with different ages and people, because that can be a good point for us to inform them what is happening and what we can do in the long run. Because in the short run, we know that we're going to have 5 more years of his presidency.
Thank you. Pedro Vaca Villarreal, you are the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. You must know and hear a lot about these issues that Luis has brought up. Tell us a little bit about your perspective on the state of play in Central America on freedom of expression, and especially on this issue of misinformation, propaganda. How serious is it really?
Good morning. Thank you, Eric, and thank you to the Wilson Center, to USAID, the State Department for the invitation. I will follow my presentation in Spanish.
Sure,
I think it's easier.
sure, claro.
Bueno, en perspectiva, el 2020
Let's get some perspective. 2022 isn't over yet, and it's already the most lethal year for journalists in history. And the killing of journalists is just one of many, many forms of censorship. And when we talk about civic space, we're talking about lots of forms of censorship that are deployed. Pressure is real for journalists, for anyone who chooses to raise their voice. So I'd like to take advantage of being here to say that our office is available to visit anyone who's been imprisoned for using their freedom of expression. There are cases where we've received requests to visit journalists who have been jailed, but then we are refused access. And there's a paradox, because we're in an inter-American human rights system in which the governments present themselves as democracies, but any prison with a journalist in it ought to be open to someone like me in my position, and yet I cannot. It's not as easy as it should be. And international scrutiny over freedom of expression issues is on the decline. You have civil society doing its work, but many governments are very reticent or just entirely closed off to observers. Now, digital democracy, this is one of the pillars, and from what we've seen from my office, there are some fundamental challenges. First, we're seeing a deterioration in the public debate. In any society, there's content, higher quality content and lower quality content, and pluralistic democratic states will have that, but some voices can be fairly said to be higher quality, political debate, etc. But some public figures are actually providing quite low quality content. So this is really a battle for democracy, and we have propaganda versus journalism. And that battle is waged on many fronts. One is resources. Those who use propaganda tend to have deep pockets, while journalism is less well funded. Quick propaganda appeals to emotions. That's disinformation, while journalism calls one to reflect upon complex ideas. Propaganda is easy. And as we were saying before, it's in the dark places that the rule of law is attacked. And as said before, the judicial system is the last line of defense. But propaganda can have impacts on the judges themselves. Sometimes the executive branch is so popular that a judge who's trying to protect freedom of expression, and that's exposed by these strongmen and said to be negative for society, it's a problem. In 2022, there are many people who believe that propaganda is good and healthy, the government is being effective, and journalism is bad. It's bad for society. It hinders the work of the government, and that is actually a problem, particularly in the digital space. So that's why digital democracy is so important, because people are feeling disappointed in democracy, and that has its impact. And there's something else I want to mention. I know there's not time to go in depth into it, but content moderation in the internet space is vital to digital democracy, and it's something we'll have to reflect on. So in sum, it's vital to bear in mind that we not only need to support democratic voices across the region, but it's also important to preserve those good examples of democracy, because what I fear is that that group of states that might head down an autocratic path is growing. And you would need to be careful about countries going down that route of propaganda and weakening democracy. You mentioned an interesting point.
Digital literacy, and I think about this too, because it's one thing for, as you said, Luis, a group of people to have their phone and look at TikTok and all that. It's another thing to interact with that information critically. What's the source? What is it telling us? Are you, Tracoda, the Relatoria, engaged in that kind of work to try to elevate the knowledge, the literacy that needs to accompany not just access, but to be able to critically evaluate those sources? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, this is all.
Sí, y creo que este año 2022, porque creo que también es bueno hablar de
Yes,
lo que se ha hecho, ¿no?
it being 2022, it's good to talk about what we have accomplished. At the Summit of the Americas, there was a commitment to digital transformation that included digital literacy as one of the key objectives. And there are a couple angles here. First, there is digital inclusion. Which is seen as an economic or a telecommunications issue. But it also has a bearing on human rights and democracy. And then the other component is the development of civic capabilities. It's not enough to have people connected to the internet so that you can sell them things and grow the economy. We need to ensure that people have that crucial set of digital skills so that they're not just consuming information, but evaluating the content. And this is a task for those who are designing the platforms that distribute the information. There's a component here that starts with programming and goes all the way to content consumption and everything in between, including content creation. It's sad. In so many countries, propaganda, disinformation flows freely, whereas true journalism encounters obstacle after obstacle to reach the audience.
While I was at the roundtables at the Summit of the Americas, I think it's very important to bring the private sector.
Oh.
Google, for example, Meta, for example, are important to have in the discussion because they can regulate at some point what is happening and what is spreading so rapidly. We are seeing in El Salvador how one tweet can expand and go beyond our borders. But when the journalists have some investigation, it's just a few people that are reading that. And having different controls towards fake news and disinformation is important. And having these actors from the private sector into the conversation is important because we can look for some accountability because there is none right now.
Claudia, you mentioned, and there was hints of this from the rest of you too, that we're not talking just about a problem in a country. We're talking about, the ways in which this spreads, becomes visible in other places. Earlier discussion we were discussing how Honduras is now, declaring a state of exception. There's a conversation going on in Guatemala along the same lines. These issues are regional, not just, each has a particular Guatemala, Salvador, and Honduran component, but they're more regional, right? That presents a broader challenge.
Sí, definitivamente. Yo creo que es un problema
Yes,
de países
absolutely.
pequeños que están muy entrelazados.
It is an issue for small countries that are highly interconnected, and so we see a contagion of sorts. In Nicaragua, there are political prisoners who tried to run against Ortega. In Guatemala, we've got a situation in which we have elections next year, and there's a pattern in place. If they see that nothing happens, if nothing's going to happen to them for limiting the freedom to run for office, maybe nothing will happen to us either. I would repeat that a key issue here is organized crime. We're seeing the influence of drug trafficking across the board, all different political parties. We have to understand that it's affecting the whole region. We're small countries. If you lose democratic values in one place, it will affect others. Nicaragua is one thing, but if it extends to Costa Rica, we've got migration flowing northwards to the U.S. That is the outcome of shrinking democratic space. There's a direct relationship there between violence and level of democracy, and our region is being seriously impacted by these criminal gangs.
I thought it was really important that we get some of these stories on the record here, and I know you know this already, but it's really the challenges that the region face are profound at every level. They're not just election challenges, but they have to do with rule of law and disinformation. So talk to us a little bit about what kinds of responses there are from the United States. We have the Voices initiatives. What are the things that are driving these initiatives from the United States?
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Benjamin. Thanks to the Wilson Center in Seattle. Thanks to my co-panelists for sharing your experiences. Thanks for the efforts that you are conducting through your own work to protect and defend civic space. I think one of the key aspects of U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America is, as Secretary Blinken has said on several occasions, supporting, equipping, demonstrating that democracies can provide for their people, democracies deliver. And one of the principal aspects of the Voices Initiative, and this is a USAID fact sheet that we have copies of here, states pretty clearly that when civil society is free to flourish, governments are more accountable, and thus they perform better. And that's kind of the underlying premise of our effort to focus on, through the Voices Initiative, protecting, defending, growing civic space in Central America so that civil society can engage with their governments, hold them accountable, spur better track records. We have come to this initiative that was launched by Administrator Power at the Summit of the Americas in June through conversations with many of the people in this room, many of courageous actors in civil society in Central America that are working to protect and defend civic space and have indicated to us a trend that we also feel acutely, that civic space is shrinking in Central America, and that there is a real need to work through an interagency process in the U.S. government, but also with stakeholders from civil society, like-minded governments, international actors, to put our heads together and come up with solutions to protect and defend that civic space. We are doing so through a variety of tools that we have as part of the U.S. government, but I will underscore that we are doing it in partnership with many other actors, and I can't say that enough, that we are but one player in this framework of a real concerted effort to protect and defend civic space in Central America. Voices is a platform, and we can get into some of the resources associated with Voices here in a minute, but it really is a platform that brings together efforts from the U.S. government to work with civil society actors in Central America through our diplomacy, direct diplomacy with governments in Central America, but also with like-minded partners throughout the world, calls for governments to receive international observers to come and visit. We heard of a need to visit prisoners, those who have been arrested, but also to monitor progress for freedom of speech, freedom of press, work with like-minded actors to join U.S. government efforts, our public remarks, but also our sanctions tools. We know that sanctions are more effective when done in a multilateral framework that call to account bad actors that are undermining democratic institutions, that are closing civic space through their actions. We're also working through our public remarks to draw attention to specific cases that are of concern. We've mentioned here Virginia La Parra, who was recently declared a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International. That's of grave concern and a specific case that's part of a larger trend. We are working through our public remarks to also demonstrate support for and solidarity with civil society actors who are brave, are demonstrating incredible resilience in their actions, in their societies, to shine a light on and calls for transparency, to bring together civil society actors in coordination so that their efforts can have a multiplier effect. We are working, I've mentioned sanctions. We have several tools that have been given to us by the U.S. Congress to call to account corruption. And this is a bipartisan commitment from the U.S. Congress to equip us with more tools and even some Central America-specific tools, recognition from Congress that this is a really important space for the U.S. government to be collecting information and also calling to account bad actors who are undermining democratic institutions. And then finally, we recognize that there is a foreign assistance component to our efforts through the Voices Initiative. And Administrator Power announced $42 million of USAID assistance that will go to support the key aspects of the Voices Initiative. And you heard Undersecretary Zaya mention them, and I'll reiterate them here. The focuses are threefold: promoting digital democracy and countering digital authoritarianism, promoting freedom of expression and strengthening independent media, and countering criminalization and providing protections for those who are targeted. And the $42 million that Administrator Power announced at the Summit of the Americas in June consists of resources allocated to USAID through fiscal year 2021 appropriations process. And these are resources for El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, some administered bilaterally and some through the regional platform. These are funds that some of these funds have already been put into ongoing programs. Others will support new funding opportunities to be announced, primarily through USAID missions. And these are resources that are dedicated to specifically the themes of the Voices initiatives. And this is speaking just specifically to USAID programming. DRL, the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, the State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement is also has announced calls for future opportunities as well. And so I think this is the start of an initiative. Voices really is a platform that goes beyond just the foreign assistance resources that have been announced, and really depends also on the role and input and ongoing engagement with really important stakeholders, including civil society actors and including a lot of the actors that are in this room today.
Thank you. I really appreciate this, all of it, but I mean this idea that it requires ongoing engagement with civil society, and the Undersecretary emphasized that as well in her speech, and I think that's really welcome. We've all lived in kind of this world of top-down dictates that come from somewhere and don't really reflect the reality of what our panelists are saying, so I appreciate that. I wonder if you could say a word about how that actually happens. I mean, what are some of the mechanisms where there is this ongoing engagement, especially at the country level. And then I'd like to ask our panelists each in our last minutes to reflect a little bit about how you think the Voices initiatives can help your efforts, and how they could be made better, and what are some of the things you might want to caution about. Because sometimes good intentions aren't enough, and sometimes they can cause more trouble than not. I'm not accusing anything, but I mean I think it's a reality. So, what are some of these mechanisms to make sure that this isn't just a statement, but there's actually this ongoing dialogue, and then what our panelists think could be done to strengthen, improve, and how it's complementary.
Absolutely, and we have learned from past experience that it's essential that we be in constant communication with important stakeholders so that we have that real-time feedback, and our initiatives and our efforts from the part of the U.S. government are not causing more harm, and so that's essential. Some of it are dialogues and forums like today in Washington, but as Eric, you mentioned, a lot of the real important feedback comes at the country level, and one important aspect of the Voices initiative is that it is really locally driven. situation. We are engaging constantly through our embassies, our USAID missions in countries in Central America, working with stakeholders. Some of that's quiet, recognizing that these are sensitive discussions. Some of it is through public fora as well. And so we would welcome civil society actors engaging with our embassies and our missions. This is an ongoing discussion and one that we're committed to regular dialogue, regular engagement with civil society, much of which will happen in country.
Excellent. Just a reminder then, in about 8 minutes, I'm going to turn to the audience and ask for your questions and input as well. So be prepared. But let me start with Claudia again. You know, you've been very involved and personally touched by these attacks on the justice system and all that. How is this Voices initiative helpful to the efforts of Guatemalan civil society and judges, and how might it be complementary to some of the things you're doing? What can you tell us?
Bueno, creo que es un programa.
Well, I think this is a key program at a time in which the region is facing many challenges, in which we see that a number of those people who have played a very important role have been forced or compelled to leave, giving up the positions they held as civil servants, as journalists, as human rights activists. And I think that through this program, mechanisms, a fellows mechanism can be stood up to assist those people who are targets of persecution perpetrated by those fighting against democracy through universities. We've been holding a number of different universities at George Mason, at the Center Against Organized Crime, to offer support to those who are being persecuted as a result of corruption, and what can be done to help those people who continue in their countries, not just Guatemala. Well, I do think we have to see this from the international perspective. Pedro has said as much through the rapporteurships. A focus can be placed on this, but the inter-American system as well as the international UN system both have to make a greater effort to address this issue. This could be done jointly between the different rapporteurships of freedom of expression, indigenous persons, judicial independence, matters of gender matters, to make sure that this be a coordinated group effort and not be done as one-off isolated attempts. And to address those who have captured the system, who have created a system in which very few people have control over the levers of power who could hold them accountable. So let's not forget that one of the first actions that autocratic groups often take is to control the courts. We saw this in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and we're seeing this throughout the region. Bukele, one of the first things that he did was to oust the judges of the Constitutional Court. We're seeing this in Guatemala, in which justices and judges are being attacked. Honduras in the midst of a very important judicial election process. We need to focus our attention on that. Efforts are afoot in Honduras to ensure that the international community stays abreast of this matter. There are international panels promoted by civil society that are engaged in this. So we need to continue these efforts. There needs to be a regional effort to ensure that these panels actually have a positive effect. It's all good and well for them to be a channel of communication, but they actually have to have some type of practical salutary effect. Now, in Ukraine, some years back, there was an effort internationally working with civil society to prop up those judges who are working for corruption. Now, you've got the anti-corruption courts themselves, and also the trial courts and the judiciary committees, all of which play a role to make sure the whole system is working well.
Between your efforts and the efforts of civil society and the U.S. government on this Voices initiative. It goes beyond AID, includes the whole of government. What do you see as a positive there, and what are some of the challenges?
I'm going to switch to Spanish right now.
Okay.
Yo creo que un tema.
Now, there's a matter of internal communication between agencies, which is very important. I must stress this, not just at the regional level, working with civil society, but also the work among those agencies in the United States. This is important to ensure we can receive greater information and to broaden the group of stakeholders that can offer input. I am grateful to the U.S. State Department and USAID because over the last couple of months we've held many meetings, and that's been very good. But we do need to do something more concrete. Civil society does not have sufficient wherewithal to prepare itself, to steel itself against what's coming. We see the path we're going down. We see how quickly we're headed down that path. The Dictator's Handbook is nothing compared to what we've seen in El Salvador in just a matter of a couple of years. And ultimately what's going to happen is there are many problems that are going to result from this in migration. We've got in Nicaragua and Guatemala dictatorial governments which are expelling people. People are leaving for lack of resources. The Administrator, Samantha Power, just said that we have to be bold. This is a time to be bold. We have to act more quickly. I understand bureaucracy. I understand that we're talking about taxpayers' money, but this is very important because we are your neighbors. In the National Security Strategy, it said that the Western Hemisphere is what can have the greatest migratory effect on the United States. Now, we don't want to see a situation in which a dictator takes over and stays in office for 20 or 30 years. What we're seeing is the first step toward that, and we have to inform people about this. So we have to think outside the box because ultimately, as I said before, we can't continue doing the same thing expecting different results. We have to take a look at those mechanisms in place that can strengthen civil society, because if that is not done, civil society is going to be expelled, as it was in Nicaragua. And universities themselves will be affected. This is a vicious circle we are witnessing, and it seems that everything's on hold. Well, we've kept open communication. Yes, that does need to happen. Channels of communication have to be kept open with the government, but there have to be measures in place to make sure that the civic space be kept alive. And we need to hold talks that meet a certain threshold of requirements so we can continue working. Otherwise, we are condemned to go through what other countries have gone through. These initiatives, such as Tracota's initiative, we would like to see more of this. So those initiatives that do exist need to be supported, and work needs to be done at the local level, the grassroots level, working with local authorities and local people. Otherwise, we are going to be condemned to go through what neighboring countries have gone through, and other countries are going to have happened to them what is happening in El Salvador, because we're seeing a model of excellence in authoritarianism. So we have to be more effective and quicker also in our communications.
Not a member of civil society directly, but you have a very important role here with civil society, independent press, etc. How can your initiatives and the OAS be complementary here to the Voices initiative? Where are the things that we should be looking to work on together?
Bueno, muchas gracias. A ver, yo creo que un poco atendiendo la pregunta, yo creo que hay dos.
I think there are two very important dimensions here. based on what I see, we're not really getting in front of the deterioration of civic space. We're not preventing it. We have a lot of people in exile, journalists who are covering different aspects, and they have been compelled to leave. They've been expelled. So those in exile play an important role and should be a part of the Voices project. It's not just a humanitarian issue. It's about the work that's being done in increasingly difficult situations. And we're talking about the budget of a media outlet in some of the countries mentioned here. It's not just a line item for the cost of journalists and equipment. There's also security, lawyers that have to be paid for, emergency funds have to be allocated for that. And so today's media outlet is more costly than yesterday's media outlet. So this hefty investment has to be made. We also have to bolster multilateralism and speak from the standpoint of where I currently operate at the ICHR, at the OES, and we have to follow through on commitments states have taken on. When I look at the commitments taken on at the Summit of the Americas, there are a number that have been raised in this conversation here. When I look at those resolutions that have been approved by the General Assembly 2 months back or a couple months back in Peru, we talk about the deterioration of public debate, misinformation, the digital realm, and that's where multilateralism is important. We have to urgently come up with inter-American standards on this. Just by way of example, limits have to be placed on the use of propaganda. Propaganda has to have limits placed on it, strictures, and also hate speech in the public realm, political violence that emerges in these discussions. And so that is where the OAS and the ICHR can make their contribution.
To some of these ideas that have been put on the table?
They're all excellent ideas, and we are joined here by some of our programmatic experts who have, can share more in depth, perhaps during the Q&A, about some of the programs that we are have already stood up and are running under the Voices Initiative. We have sought to do digital literacy, and I think we've gotten a lot of really great ideas on how to do that most effectively here today. We've also sought to adequately resource investigative journalism. Pedro, you mentioned one of the principal challenges of journalism today are the number of resources that are required to do it well, do it safely, and that is juxtaposed against the immediacy and, frankly, cheapness of propaganda. So we're seeking to more adequately resource investigative journalism. Those are two examples. I think there are a lot more specifics that we've gotten from the conversation today that will undoubtedly feed our programmatic development in the months to come.
Thank you. And I just, wanted to highlight something that Luis said too. Really, how do we ensure that the money to do these things, which we all agree are important, actually gets to the people on the ground doing the work? That's the perennial challenge that foreign aid faces. Okay, running just a tad late than I'd like, but I see there's some people in the audience that no doubt have questions. Please raise your hand. I think I'll take 3, and then we'll give people an opportunity to respond up here. I see Pat Davis in the back. I would like to encourage my friends from Honduras who haven't been on this panel to ask a question. And then, of course, what would we be without an independent press asking a question here? So, Jose Luis, you're right there. So, Jose Luis first. Somebody should go back to Pat Davis, and we'll take a third one. Yeah, there's a third one there. Okay, go ahead, Jose Luis.
Thank you. Voy a hacer mi pregunta en español. Es para Emilio Vendrala.
I will ask my question in Spanish. It's for Emily Mandrala. Software of U.S. allies has been used in Central America to spy against civil society and journalists. A group of FARA journalists just filed a suit in California against a U.S. sanction group. What is the institutional position of the U.S. regarding spyware being used against journalists in Central America, and what diplomatic efforts are being undertaken to ensure accountability or transparency regarding spyware being used in that way?
But go ahead, somebody take her the mic. And can you tell us where you're from?
Yes, I'm Pat Davis with Peace Brigades International. My question is for Claudia and Emily. Claudia, you mentioned that the attacks on judges are coming because of networks of narco-traffickers that are becoming stronger and stronger in the region. And in some of the attacks on judges, it's been clear that former military members are attempting to avoid prosecution, like with the recent ousting of Miguel Ángel Galvez in the Diario Militar case. And in other cases, like with the refusal to seat Judge Gloria Porras, who had been so helpful to indigenous communities that were seeking justice when their resources had been illegally taken from them, usually by large-scale development projects. Is there a link between these narco-trafficking networks and military and former military? And is there a link between these networks and some of the development projects that are underway in Guatemala? And if so, has the U.S. government mapped these links? Because if this is a whole of government response, it seems important to know what those links are and for those to be taken into account in terms of our funding of the military and our imports and our public-private partnerships.
Thanks, Pat. There was a question right there, and the gentleman in the striped shirt. I'll take that one, and then we'll give our panelists a chance to respond.
Thank you. Should I stand up or whatever? Okay. My name is Logan Puck. I'm a visiting assistant professor at George Washington University. This question is primarily for Luis and Emily. I'm curious, you talk about the importance of demonstrating that democracy delivers, and I'm wondering how you convince populations that democracy does deliver. In countries like Guatemala and El Salvador, you've had democracy for about 30 years, and leaders have mostly been corrupt and ineffective. You have high crime levels, high poverty rates, and therefore democracy really hasn't delivered. And second, how you convince people in a place like El Salvador that Bukele is not an example of democracy in action, and that he's elected in a free and fair election. The legislature is controlled by his party, and there are results, whether they've been done democratically or not. We do see crime rates dropping, right? Whether this is due to some kind of illegal truce, whether this is due to mano dura or some outside factors. I'm just curious how you convince people this is not democracy when we see this president is wildly popular, right, and is elected by a wide majority. This is not me supporting this president, and I think these efforts are great. I'm just curious how you actually convince people to, turn against these type of regimes.
Good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, Emily?
Okay. I'll go first. First of all, Jose Luis, thank you so much for your question. It's a really good one. I can say categorically, support freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and we condemn actions on the part of governments, any government, to threaten that, to limit it, to put at risk actors who are seeking to exercise their liberties of freedom of press and freedom of expression. We urge actions in accordance with rule of law, and that goes for spying technology, that goes for efforts to curb protests, that goes for efforts to limit investigative journalism by threats or harassment or the use of judicial misuse of judicial processes. Pat, your question is a really good one about links between corrupt actors and how the U.S. government operates as a whole. I think the specific case that you mentioned is an important one, but there's also, I think, this applies more broadly. We are all the time seeking to find information. We get some of that information from civil society actors, some through our own U.S. government personnel, and we have an imperative, a policy imperative, to use that information to inform our decisions. We also have statutes and policies that are guiding the way that we use foreign assistance. Leahy vetting for security assistance, for example. We have some of our sanctions statutes are obligatory. If we have information implicating individuals in corrupt acts, we are obligated to act on that and to issue sanctions. So I think we have a network of tools that we are endeavoring to use to both inform our policy direction and to put in place actions that condemn corrupt or undemocratic actions. And then, George, your question is a really good one. It's George, right? Yeah, is that your name? Logan, sorry. Logan. It's a really good one and gets to the heart of the effort on the part of the U.S. government and democracies around the world to showcase that democracies can deliver. And I would argue that a lot of the specific instances that you mentioned in your examples are examples of anti-democratic actions. And so one goal of ours, one task of ours, is to shine a light. And I think really at the core of a lot of our efforts is transparency. To, on our part, shine a light, to equip and empower civil society to shine a light, to use tools of transparency to show where governments are acting in democratic ways, strengthening democratic institutions to provide for their people, and when there is co-optation of power or corruption that is undermining those democratic institutions to funnel resources and gain to corrupt actors. And it's a daunting task, and one that we are embarking on not just in Central America, but throughout the hemisphere, throughout the world. One of President Biden's core foreign policy beliefs is that corruption is a national security threat to the United States. And that it is imperative for us throughout our foreign policy to be combating corruption, not just in our foreign policy either. He's made it clear that this is something that starts at home too, as we are working to strengthen our own institutions to guard against corruption, so that we can see democracy at work, we can see democracy overcome anti-democratic actions, and we can see democracies deliver for their people.
Thank you. Any other comentario del panel? ¿O vuelvo a las preguntas?
Sobre las preguntas?
Sí.
Sí. Bueno, yo
Shall I respond to the questions? I'd like to respond to the question about the link or links between attacks on the justice system. And I do think that there are alliances there of groups that have benefited from judicial weakness in the region. Among them, you have human rights violators that were brought to justice at critical times. There are companies that aren't meeting legal requirements regarding natural resource extraction, those that are evading taxes or aren't paying fair wages. And then you've got the corrupt politicians who've been exposed. And there was a window of opportunity in our country when there was an international effort led by the CICIG, the International Commission Against Impunity. And when you have those windows of opportunity to strengthen democratic institutions, it's very important. But there are those who have tried to use resources to enrich themselves illegally. And there are times in the U.S. when there were historic moments where there had to be structural changes that were difficult. For instance, the Civil War in this country, where there were states that were benefiting from an unjust system, were benefiting from slavery to enrich certain people, and there had to be a war to put a stop to that. So building democratic values in Central America hasn't been easy, with the exception of Costa Rica. Other countries historically have had our series of civil wars, dictatorships. We're post-conflict societies where there's this narrative that efforts to build sound institutions are ideological, when that is not the case. There need to be partnerships amongst all actors who want to have rule of law. We need to get together the media, civil society, academia, justice operators, and the international community so that we can change these patterns. Otherwise, we're going to end up becoming a region that's ultimately in the hands of criminals, and that's a security issue for the whole region.
Question.
The Logan question. Yeah. So I really understand your logic about this question, because in a country which the other governments set the bar so low, people, the mindset of the people are like, yeah, my president had things done. So democracy is still the best system to govern. It's a hard task. Maybe I don't have the answer right now, but it's keep working. The organizations, the civil society organization needs to keep building to work with the people for them to understand that democracy is the best way. Because if not, they're going to take your human rights. And that's happening right now. I had this conversation with a lady, and she was so grateful because at one moment at the pandemic, the government gave $300. No other government did that. And for a lot of people, $300 was amazing. One in a lifetime, perhaps, to have that amount of money. And they were happy. But we see the other phase when the estado de excepción began. And one lady was like crying because they took her son. And she said, yeah, I'm going to give back these $300, but I want my son back. So on one hand, we had results because we are seeing results. But the way that they are doing that is not the way to go. So, yeah.
I'm sad that we've run out of time. I'd love to hear from our friends from Honduras and others, but we need to wrap this up. Thank you all very much. I think, it's obvious to say it, but it's worth repeating. I think fundamentally the threats against civic space, civil society, are threats against democracy. And so we need to think about the stakes as being extraordinarily high. And we appreciate the State Department, U.S. government, I don't mean just the State Department, identifying this as a really important aspect of U.S. policy. I think it's very timely. And I think, those of us in civil society, the folks that are on the table in this room, I think stand ready to think critically about how to do that effectively, because what's at stake is the future of the region, right? And the future of democracy. It's not just about elections, but it's about all these other issues as well. And so I think that's the compromiso. How do you say that in English? Commitment. And Benjamin, too, his and Wilson Center, I know, is committed to this same agenda. So thank you all very much. Thanks to the staff, the interpreters, the technical staff that made this possible. Thank you all.